The Canadian Rockies are home to wild valleys and wild mountains, but there are some peaks that tower above all others. The 11,000ers, 54 peaks whose summits rise above 11,000 feet and mark the highest points in the range. They offer some of the most spectacular scenery in the Rockies. The 11,000ers are often guarded by vast glaciers and ice fields, and are notorious for uncooperative wind and weather. Those seeking to climb these peaks can count on unplanned challenges and high adventure. For these mountains, getting there is often more than half the battle. With long technical approaches, even reaching the base of these peaks can be a journey like no other. And there is no 11,000 or more challenging to reach than Tsar. In the fall of 2018, two friends decided to climb Tsar Mountain on foot. Tsar is arguably the hardest of the 54 11,000ers in the Rockies to access without using helicopters. Liam on the left and me, Ben, on the right. We have partnered on many trips previously and set aside a 2-week window for this plan.
Hello, I'm Liam Harrap, and I'm from Jasper, and I like mountains.
Liam was born and raised in Jasper, Alberta, a place where I now find myself living and working. We would start our approach south of Jasper, leaving from the Icefields Parkway near the Columbia Icefields Center, then hiking west towards Tsar Mountain, a peak nestled between the Clemenceau Icefield and the Kinbasket Reservoir. Our plan would see us climb Tsar and then exit by rafting across the Kinbasket Reservoir to a logging road near the outlet of the Sullivan River.
When did I first hear about Tsar? Probably when I first bought the 11,000er book. I don't think I would have heard of it before then, because it is far away out there. My expertise was always in Jasper, and it's not in Jasper. So I'm sure it was just browsing through the 11,000er book, and in the first edition it has a very pretty photo that made it always stand out with all the glaciers falling off of it and everything. So, and the name, I mean, Tsar, King, like that's pretty cool.
The 54 11,000ers had first been climbed by celebrated Canadian alpinist Sylvia Forest, and ascent routes were later chronicled by Bill Corbett in his guidebook, The 11,000ers of the Canadian Rockies.
I'm Bill Corbett, a longtime resident of Calgary, grew up in Edmonton, but at least half my life in Calgary, and have been climbing, backcountry skiing, hiking in the Rockies for probably 35 years. What drew me to the Rockies was the fact they're in my backyard. I mean, I've heard some people say it's the biggest backyard that's uncrowded in the world. So yeah, the Rockies were the obvious place to go, whether it was driving from Edmonton to Jasper, Calgary to Banff or Kananaskis. I'm a writer by profession, so I've done a number of guidebooks. When I proposed this book to Rocky Mountain Books, Tony Daffern was still the publisher. And just from having done all this backcountry stuff, my first interest was doing a book on lightweight backcountry cooking, like dehydrated recipes, how you could cut weight. And then at the very end of the proposal to him, I said, oh, and if that's not of interest to you, how about this book on the 11,000ers? And he said, well, there's lots of cookbooks out there. Forget that, but I'm kind of interested in this 11,000er book. So from the beginning, for me, the interesting part was not just how do you get up these routes, but the history, because it's such a rich history from, mostly Brits and Americans from the East Coast who are well-educated, can write well. So it was to try and combine, the history plus the roots. And I'm used to writing. So at the time, there were 54 known 11,000ers. So you just write them one piece at a time.
So my name is Sylvia Forest, and I think my biggest claim to fame is I am the daughter of Don Forest, who, yes, he did climb, the first person to climb all the 11,000-foot peaks in the Rockies and the Columbia Mountains, but mostly he was just a really cool person. So I think that's the biggest thing. He got me climbing when I was very young, probably kept me out of a lot of trouble, actually, when I was a young kid, and set me on a course of loving the mountains, which eventually got me into the warden service, where I worked for 23 years. And in that time, I became a mountain guide with the ACMG and finished my career with the warden service doing mountain rescue in Jasper and at the very end in Glacier Park, where I managed the program. Growing up and being taken to the mountains by my dad, Don Forest, from the age of about 8 or 9, climbing was just part of life. So every single weekend we'd go to the mountains. And on a number of occasions, we would have the opportunity to climb 11,000-foot peak. And I was with him for quite a number of them over many, many years. And I guess I started twigging on to the idea that the ones that were over 11,000 feet were special, often a little bit more difficult, a little bit more remote. Being big mountains, they were heavily glaciated, usually, very difficult access. And the time that I kind of figured out that it was something to go for was when my dad realized he only had 5 or 6 left to do. And he said, hey, there's only 5 or 6 left. I should go do them. And I thought, oh, okay, that's a significant goal.
Always so hard to know what to think when it's so many days. The trip is so, when it's a 2-week trip. The first day is always, in many ways, the worst, because your pack is so heavy. You think of, oh dear God, like I've, packed too many puddings or something, or when can I go to bed? And the objective is always so far away. I mean, it wasn't nice weather that day. So, I'll admit, I thought there was a strong possibility that the trip might not work. Because, it's far, there's a lot of unknowns, there's a lot of snow coming, and my pack was heavy, and I felt fat.
For the first day of the trip, heading into the Mount Alberta hut, my girlfriend Kat asked to join Liam and I, eager to see some of the scenery around the hut. She is a bit shy and did not want to appear in this film. Leaving the Icefields Parkway, we would follow a route west over a high mountain pass called Wooley's Shoulder into the Lloyd McKay hut, nestled between 2 11,000ers, Mount Alberta and Mount Wooley. The hut has been an oasis for alpine climbers and used for decades.
My name is Peter Amann. I'm a mountain guide and I live in Tijon, BC, but most of my years have been spent in Jasper, Alberta. It was always been a dream of mine is just to be in the mountains, and I think for a long time I always dreamed of working at a ski hill and living in a mountain town, and when I got to Jasper it just seemed like the magical thing to do, and I've just came here and never left. So yeah, I don't know what the exact draw was, but it was just the mountains in general. Well, it's always a challenge to guide a lot of the 11,000ers. They have a reputation. People want to climb these bigger peaks, and few of them are near the road. So there's always the challenge and intrigue of doing a bigger trip into rugged mountain terrain. So many of the 11,000ers are a challenge, and I think that's what draws us to them. My favorite 11,000er, I would still have to stick with Mount Athabasca, just because I've been up that one more than any other mountain that I've climbed. And I think it's always been special because every time it's different. And though having climbed a number of the other ones, I still found that Athabasca was special because, first of all, it was visible from the road, and I've had the opportunity to take a lot of people up it. So I'd have to say one of the special ones.
I had never been over Woolly Shoulder before. It was a lot harder than expected. I mean, it's never a good feeling when you've read on the ACC Hut that it's 5 to 7 hours and a strenuous hike, and you're like crawling and having so much difficulty just going up the scree, and the scree is, bulletproof from all the ice, and there's a lot of snow, and it's windy and very unpleasant. It's not the best for the morale when pretty much all the days afterwards might be harder, and you're already really struggling on day one. But then I always think day one is the hardest because you're out of shape. You have to, get your body, whip it into, shape and effort, and iron out all the wrinkles, in your boots and on your back, and how your pack fits. And you always tell yourself you'll just eat a really big dinner that night and your pack will be so much lighter the next day. Lloyd McKay Hut was beautiful. Like, I had never seen it before. I knew it was small. And so that wasn't surprising. It would have been nice if it was heated, because all my stuff was still frozen, and all my socks, I think, were frozen and wet. So that was, that would have been nice if there had been, maybe some oil to burn, but it was out of the snow and the wet from outside, so that was really welcome. And I could have dinner and snacks.
I once had some friends. This is staying at Woolly Hut, and one day I remember in the early 80s they were all up there, and I actually hiked in that morning, left really early, got to the hut by about 10 in the morning, and they were all still asleep, and I had to bite my tongue to not laugh really hard because I just stood outside the door and just knocked on the door to see what they would do. But other than that area has always been a spectacular place, and as well as having been up there with the Mount Alberta project in 2000, we got to climb Woolly and Diadem, and it's a pretty spectacular place. And sitting right next to Mount Alberta, it was you always had Mount Alberta, over your shoulder or taking up the whole skyline in front of you.
When we left the hut the next day, I was a little bit worried for Kat. I felt a little bit bad since she had to go home alone over the call. Because the snow was quite deep. Like, it was in many places up to your waist. And it had snowed a lot more than expected. so I didn't really know how that would go for the mountain itself. Luckily, it was many days away, so it had lots of chances to melt. But it was a little bit sad leaving, because you're leaving the hut, like, where it's nice and warm and sheltered. Well, warm is relative, meaning not wet. And yeah, it's always hard to leave shelter to go out in the elements when it's unpleasant.
Past the hut, there were no more trails, and progress slowed as we made our way towards our next destination, Snowy Pass.
I mean, my favorite areas in the backcountry, maybe I'll first start with that, is I like areas that have a little bit of ice, but a lot of greenery. Like, I really like plants. I guess, yeah, I really like plants. So I think a mixture of the two, of ice, plants, and really craggly mountains. Like, my favorite mountains are ones that you don't know that much about. It's more adventurous. If you just sort of go tip your toe into the lake and see if it works out. You just have your map. And you more or less don't know much about the mountain until you're on it yourself, to see if you can make it through those cliff bands, or maybe you didn't realize there was a false summit, and actually the real thing is behind it, and it's far more difficult to get to than you would have thought. Yeah, like, my favorite mountains are mountains that are puzzles, and that you don't know much about, and you really have no idea how it's going to go until you're on it.
Well, because the Rockies are, there's a lot of loose rock, limestone, that makes it sort of perilous, or it's something you have to pay a lot of attention to. By contrast, the East Ridge of Edith Cavell is, it's one of the rare routes that has good solid rock, in this case, quartzite, plus the positions are fantastic, looking straight down, over glaciers to these little lakes. But that was probably one of my favorites. South Good Sur is probably my least favorite peak. If anyone who's climbed it, it is so loose and so exposed for such a long time. We had one guy on the way down when thought we were safe, who got, hit on the top of his shoulder with a rock that just came flying down. And I think he ended up with a broken bone. And we had to, back then, the way into Good Sur was over this heinous bunch of fallen logs with all these spikes from, an avalanche. And if you fell on one of those, you either went into a hole and could break your leg, or you could impale yourself. So we had to get him all the way out, over that on the way out. So yeah, it was not a favorite.
The headwaters of the Athabasca are a very special place, flowing from the northern edge of the Columbia Icefield. Peaks like Mount Columbia stretch skywards and make us feel very small. When leaving the main valley, the west face of Mount Alberta comes into full view. It is the most technical 11,000er and an inspiring peak to see.
Well, on Alberta, I mean, it's the biggest, in a sense, toughest peak of all of them, because you're dealing with such large distances, elevation gain, loose, technical climbing, a long, narrow ridge, which when we did it had snow on it, which made it additionally challenging. Plus all those rappels coming down, and, the rope getting snarled. And plus we had to bivvy on the summit ridge coming back. With the snow, took us so long. We were sleeping on, using a frozen rope as a pillow. And in the morning, I couldn't get my feet in my boots. They were leather boots because the boots were frozen. I had to take the liner out and get them in. And it's lucky I didn't have frostbite at the time. But I mean, I later got it from a ski trip. But I don't think I would have happily survived that night.
Working higher towards Snowy Pass, our packs weigh us down, but distant views of giants like Mount King Edward lift us up. Life jackets and paddles, for the pack rafting to come, seem very out of place. A few prints remind us that there is other life on this landscape, even if it is hard to see. I have never been to Snowy Pass in the summer before, but I have crossed through it 2 times, in the springs of 2014 and 2017. In the spring, the pass lives up to its name, a wintry perch bound between the Chaba and Columbia ice fields, and a great viewpoint to see Tsar Mountain, looming to the west. This time around, we were destined to head west, crossing out of Jasper National Park and into the less-known wilds of unprotected British Columbia. Our route would take us into the Sullivan River Valley, terrain that looked direct but was guarded by cliffs, canyons, and many hazards.
When we made it to Snowy Pass, it was beautiful. Like it's an amazing campsite, like right on the edge of 2 meeting ice fields, more or less. There's not much plants, but I can overlook that. It was, beautiful sand, lots of water. We had a little shelter behind a big boulder that would, protect my ramshackle of a tent from any storms. But, the view was amazing. Like, we could see our objectives are, twinkling in the distance. Morale, I think, was pretty high. Like, we'd had the sun for a few days. The snow was melting. The glacier looked very nice to walk on, very easy. It looked like sunshine and lollipops were ahead.
It was funny when I, wrote the book, I thought because it was so difficult to do it in terms of remoteness, the long approaches, the weather, the conditions, that it was taking for whoever had done it, and there was only a handful of people who climbed them all. I never thought that it was something that people would want to do them all, or would quickly abandon the attempt. So I'm surprised the number of people that sort of continually are sort of interested in this as a project. So some of the areas have gotten a little more crowded. Like I know going into Brazeau, seeing more people than I was accustomed to. But there are still so many places in the Rockies that are not sort of the brand name peaks and routes where you're not going to see anybody. I think Nancy Hansen, when she climbed them all, said that on only 5 of the 54 peaks had she actually run into other people.
What draws others to the 11,000ers? I do know that it's become a project, a goal, kind of a tick list for many. And once you've climbed them all, it's a pretty significant accomplishment, a huge accomplishment. It just seems now that it's not just climbing them, but it's climbing them. How fast can you climb them? How short a period of time can you get them climbed in? And I guess that's something I don't entirely understand, because for me it's more about getting there and getting home. But yeah, it's a huge accomplishment. And if you're a mountaineer, a climber, and it's something that has been done, and now it's something that can be done, I guess it's a tick list thing.
While simple on the map, satellite images suggested that travel in the Sullivan Valley would be difficult. It ended up taking us 2 full days to travel the 10 kilometers between Snowy Pass and the lower Sullivan River Valley. All the while, the east face of Tsar gleamed in the distance, a sheer knife ridge of rock and ice glaring down at us, close but far.
The Sullivan River Valley was probably one of the most unwelcoming looking valleys I think I've ever walked into. It was one of those where you look at it and you're like, I don't want to go in there. I think morale-wise, going down from that bench into that black cavernous hole was like a very low moment for me where I was almost like, screw you, Ben, I'm going home. I'm gonna go back to the Athabasca River and just raft home. That sounds so much nicer than, there's just some valleys that when you see them, you're like, nope, no, I'd rather not. I don't think it's gonna work. It looks unpleasant. There are so many hazards, and I have to lose so much elevation only to come all the way back up again, probably. There was nothing pleasant about it. It just didn't look like it was gonna work. That's how I felt.
The upper Sullivan River Valley has a haunting beauty, a new landscape where glaciers have only recently retreated, and signs of their passage mar the valley. On reaching the braided flats of the Sullivan River, the crux of our approach came into view. A narrow canyon that looked like it could be used to join up with an old route to ascend Tsar, based on map info and blurry satellite images. There was no way to know for sure if the route would work until we saw it with our own eyes.
When we got to where we were planning to exit the valley, up the canyon, and that would lead up eventually up to Tsar base camp, and there was just large cliffs. It was a little depressing, mainly because it was like that. I probably said this at the time. It was like that quote from Babe, Pig in the City, when she gets stranded at the airport, and there's no more planes, and the narrator says couldn't go forward and couldn't go back. That's what it felt like, because I didn't want to go back up over to the Snowy Pass, because it was so far, and there was all those bypasses of cliffs that we had to go around that were very unpleasant, and the way forward was shut. So that was depressing.
I'm not a planner. I think, and as a result, I really like doing trips with people who are planners. I think having a really good route plan, doing your homework, studying the map, having a good idea of where you're going is all pretty good fundamental stuff, which we all do. But on the same hand, that's, you asked earlier about what has changed over the years that I've been climbing. The fact that now you have Google Earth and all of these other tools that can really help you figure out, do some problem solving. I would have to say it was pretty neat back in the day, just going kind of by the seat of your pants and figuring it out. And that was the fun, the challenge, sometimes the setback because it didn't always work. But that's what you had to work with. I have to admit, I absolutely use Google Earth today because I have it. Why wouldn't you use it? But it does change, it does change things a little bit. But man, there's huge value in just being able to, let's face it, just read the terrain when you're there. You can do all the planning you want, but in the end, you have to be able to read the terrain and adjust your decision making based on weather, conditions, and the terrain that you encounter.
So as, what I would in theory like to do is when you're exploring, you do sometimes think that the way you thought at first, that you planned to go, it might not work. So, as we're walking along down the valley, I was looking at other possibilities just in case. That probably wouldn't work, but one can still dream. And so I saw that the cliffs were broken up to Apex Glacier, and I knew from the map and satellite imagery that if you got over the shoulder from the glacier, you would be fine. It was just getting up to the shoulder that was the problem. And so when the canyon didn't work, we decided to, since we're down there and we really didn't want to go back the way we came, we might as well, and we had lots of food, we might as well try something else. So we tried the Apex Glacier, which the way up was very interesting. It was kind of fun because broken cliffs and everything, and crossing rivers between waterfalls over high cliffs and things. And our base camp was pretty sweet, like right on the toe of an ice field that you could hear banging and crashing all night and rockfall coming down. And I think that's where I would hear rockfall and just snuggle into my sleeping bag, because if I can't see it, it can't see me. At least that's what one hopes.
My view of the mountains, how it's changed. Growing up, and not just on trips with my dad, but early on, I developed my own cohort of friends. And back then, it just seemed that there were a lot fewer people in the mountains. And the mountains truly felt more remote, more isolated. You really were on your own a lot more. We didn't have radios, we didn't have sat phones, we didn't have cell service, we didn't have anything like that. When you were out there, you were out there. And the only way you'd ever get a rescue is if you didn't show up for a few days. Back then, you were truly a lot more on your own. You had to be a lot more self-sufficient. There was no good exit strategy. There was no back door. And that was okay. It was cool.
When we climbed Tsar, we were fortunate in that the Sullivan River was still a viable access, and there was a bridge over that huge gorge, which was a showstopper as soon as they removed it. So we were able to drive up the Bush Road, then up the Sullivan, and come in. And it was probably a day and a half approach. And we climbed Clemenceau first. And because these Roman and Forbes had families and careers, we're always doing stuff in a day or two less than what was recommended. So we climbed Clemenceau, then moved all the way to Tsar the next day, to the base of Tsar. And the following day, we climbed Tsar and then came all the way out, drove out, came all the way back to Calgary. One thing I discovered after that was, you were getting up the peak, so there's a certain amount of tension, like what are we going to run into, how big a day? And if you could spend an extra night out in some of these places after you've done the peak, you're so relaxed that almost those experiences or images lasted longer with me than standing on the top.
Despite our best efforts, gaining the Apex Glacier was not reasonable. Morale was low, and we were starting to consider abandoning the peak altogether.
We had one last choice, and that was to continue down the river further into the eye of the storm. Because there was one really confusing thing. We kept coming across bear tracks in the valley bottom, and we were always so wondering where on earth they came from. And so it had to be somewhere. Of course, bears are pretty cool and probably can climb way better things than I ever possibly could. But you would like to think that maybe there was a more straightforward way that they came in. So we decided to follow down the river because eventually the cliffs had to end. I mean, there might be just scraps of a human left, but they would hopefully end. And there was a lot of unpleasant parts on that trip. But that's like any adventure. And following down the river was difficult and scary at times, just because it's a really mean looking river. It's deep, it's fast. The bank was very loose. There were a few places where sliding into it was likely, or a possibility. And our bags were heavy, and I probably would have gone down like a stone. And the bushwhack was thick. It was only a few kilometers, but it took hours. And there was a lot of up and down because there was just places you couldn't go. And then when we finally spotted a little hole in the cliffs, like far beyond the horizon, just getting up there, I think though it was like 1,000 meters, wasn't it? Yeah, I think it was like 1,000 meter elevation gain or something like that to get up through the cliffs. It was really hard because the bush was quite thick and prickly, and there was logs that were larger than a Liam to climb over. But at the top, there was the most amazing berry patch. Blueberries, huckleberries, chocolate bars that were just so amazing. And there was an old logging road that we didn't know in what shape it would be in, but it was pretty good. It was pretty clear and easy to follow. And that's where Ben asked, where we had a little powwow of what we should do, if we should go forward or if we should go back. Or not really go back, really follow the road out another way, I guess, with our tail between our legs. And we didn't really have an excuse not to keep going. So we did. And that's where the blueberries were, so one had to go that way.
After having snuck through bushy cliffs, we were back on the approach route published in the first edition of Bill's book, back in 2005, before the removal of the bridge over the Sullivan Gorge. Things were looking up.
So at least now we were on guidebook route, sort of. So that was really exciting. I didn't really have any concerns from there to get to base camp because guidebook route. But then it was a little concerning when we got to cross over the glacier to get to base camp, and that looked a lot harder than anticipated. I think it was just perception and angle, like it was. I remember I have this really sad photo of Ben just like draped underneath this like sad scrap of a tarp. It's pouring and the glacier looks really steep and icy. And yeah, like the weather is supposed to continue to be bad, so who knows if we can get up the mountain that's probably dumping snow on. But like the rest of the trip, I didn't really have an excuse at that exact moment to turn around. And so, might as well try it. And it kept going, and one foot kept happening in front of the other, until eventually you were on top of the glacier, and it was okay. And then the ice gave way to lakes, and plants, and camping spots, and cairns. So people had been there. That was very exciting. And yeah, we made it to base camp like a week later to a spot that mostly everyone flies into. Yeah, that was always kind of... It's always kind of funny to go to places where people always fly into. You do miss out a lot of the difficulties doing that. The hardship, the crying.
Do I have a favorite 11,000 foot peak? I don't know that I do. However, I have a couple of peaks that are really memorable, and I think one of them is Mount Bryce. I climbed that with, at the time, a very dear friend of mine, and that was sort of in the late 80s. And I tried to climb Bryce twice before and got weathered off. And this time we had really good weather. It was in ideal conditions. And it was, we didn't get all the way up and all the way down to our camp. We had to bivouac, sort of all perched on top of the final last bit getting back to our high camp. And that was a really special mountain. It's a beautiful mountain, absolutely stunning mountain. It's remote. And for me, it's not just so much the mountains, it's the people that I'm with, and it's the journey to get there and the journey home. And I think that's why Mount Bryce was so special for me. I will always think back with fondness of that mountain.
So our weather forecast that we got, the day was supposed to be sunshine and lollipops, more or less. But when our alarm went off, it was pouring rain. And so we went back to bed for a few hours, and then it stopped. And Ben and I were like, well, should we try? And like the motto of the trip, there wasn't really any reason not to. At least strikingly. My biggest concern was always the amount of snow that had fallen. That just makes peaks a lot harder when there's a lot more fresh snow and avalanches, all that type of stuff, and just more dangerous scrambling. I'll admit, Ben was a lot more into it than I was. I think like a huge thing was just the amount of snow that had fallen. I was of little faith. I didn't think it was going to work out. And so Ben was a lot more keen than I was. I think there were many times where I was just like trudging along at the back, being like, any minute now, we'll have to turn around. But then it just kept going. And eventually the rock gave way to glacier. And we kept going up and up and up. And eventually there was no more up to go. And we were at the top. Ben's last 11,000er, and we could go back down, and I could go back into my sleeping bag.
It was a beautiful route. Like it was, there's bits of loose stuff, but you're following a ridge most of the time, and the glacier had good snow on it. And I just remember Roman at the top wanting to look down to the bottom, but we were worried about the cornice, so he was on his hands and knees on a tight rope. And what was interesting when you got up on the North Ridge there was looking down at that North Face Glacier, which is just a jumble of impenetrable ice. And yet that's the route that Ostheimer did. I think they just went straight up that face in the 20s, the first ascent of the peak. So just seeing sort of the glacial recession. And I mean, that's going to affect these peaks more than anything rather than being overrun with people. I think it's just some of the routes are going to be something you can't do anymore.
Another big thing for me is just the changing landscape of the mountains. Seeing how rapidly, for example, the Rockies are drying up. Seeing the glacial recession is staggering. In my lifetime, the first time I climbed Athabasca, I was around 10 or 11. And I mean, at that time you could drive all the way up the access road almost to the base of the mountain. And, the glacier was significantly higher, like significantly. When I take a look at the glacier now, when I take a look at Skyladder, which is basically gone, it's sobering.
Since it was Ben's last 11,000er, and because it was, September, we brought White Russians, which is vodka, Kahlua, cream, and crushed ice. We were fresh out of crushed ice. So we had to collect snow on the way down for our celebration at camp. So at the last little snow patch, we collected snow for our White Russians. And of course, when we got back to camp, I found out we had been robbed. And the little cream packages of full-fat cream that I'd been carrying had been eaten by a critter. So we just ended up having dehydrated skim milk. But they still tasted good. So we were celebrating in the tent, having our White Russians, and, the time of our lives. We got an unexpected, unwelcomed message from Kat. I think she congratulated us, but then quickly added that the road was closed and we had maybe 60 more kilometers to walk. Which, it was sort of a weird moment to be in, that you're happy, like, yay, we got to the top of the mountain. Oh my god, it's so much further to get out. And we didn't even know which way to go, because we wanted to try a different way out that we really knew nothing about, and we didn't know if it would work. On our way down, we passed by where ACC camps had camped before. So there was this big cairn, and in the cairn there was this register left by this ACC camp that had got there via helicopter, as one does, saying, how beautiful, what they did, love to come back, but I don't think I ever can. And I remember we wrote an entry back being like, yes, it's very beautiful, but I don't think I can be back either. It's too far. Our way out went over, it was down a valley that we didn't really know much about, down the Kinbasket River valley, and we had to go down this head wall of cliffs that we didn't know if it would work, and they were quite long. I think they were about 1,000 meters or so. And, it was one of those that they might be fine until the very bottom, and we didn't want to have to come all the way back up. So the first bit I think was fine, open slopes, practically skipping down the slope, laughing and giggling like schoolgirls. And then, it gets a lot more thick, and with my ripped pants, I think I was collecting lots of the forest down my underwear. The last little bit was tricky. There were some cliffs at the end that we had to work our way around, and these massive moraine slopes where, rocks the size of cars are just teetering there, and it's pouring rain. And these are huge mud slopes with really nothing holding them back. So that always is a little bit disconcerting when you're going under these massive mud cliffs with rocks the size of cars, barely on. And you're just a wee little pinball at the end. If something comes along, it would just crash you. But we had made it down. As long as the cliffs didn't give way, we were gonna make it to camp. So that was exciting.
My dad got me climbing when I was quite young, and some of the big things that I did when I was, I was I think 12 when I climbed Mount Louis for the first time. Clearly being just hauled along, but it was pretty amazing. And doing all the rappels on the backside, doing body rappels back in the day. Can you imagine doing all those long rappels just using a rope wrapped around your body? That's how we did it back then. You also have to remember, being a young kid, also a girl, they didn't make harnesses to fit me. My dad got somebody to sew up something that would fit. And prior to that, I just took a bit of webbing and tied it around my waist, and away we went. So you have to remember, back then things were really different, very primitive, relatively speaking. Climbing Mount Whitehorn. It was 1974. It was the General Mountaineering Camp with the Alpine Club. And we had a subgroup go off to climb Mount Whitehorn. It was a kind of an extended camp. You left the main base camp from the Robson Valley, and we had a fly camp up at the base of Whitehorn. And there was, quite a crew of us. It was the Alpine Club, and you kind of did things en masse with the Alpine Club. I think there was like 8 or 9 of us. And we got up at some god-awful hour, like 2 or 3 in the morning, and headed up I think it was the West Ridge. And what I remember, it was just a really big day. It was a long way up, a long way down. With all those people, we didn't move all that fast. And it was an 18-hour day for a 14-year-old kid. That was kind of a really big day. We had beautiful weather. I remember piling back into camp at, 9 o'clock at night or something like that. And one of the folks that came along didn't go on the climb, so he had dinner ready for us. It was absolutely god-awful, some horrible soupy mess that was burnt and tasted like a dog's breakfast. And piling back into the tent at night, being absolutely exhausted. For me at this point, the climbing of these mountains is, like I said before, it's about the journey, it's about the camaraderie, it's about the friendship. And there are a few that I really would like to get up that I haven't yet, that are on the horizon. And if I get them all done, great. And if I don't, that's okay.
We knew we had to travel open water at the end of the trip, so we had brought pack rafts this whole time. So this day was very exciting because we would eventually get to use these pack rafts, which were taking up, quite a considerable size of my backpack, along with, paddles, a life jacket, all that type of stuff, like taking up a large part of my backpack. So this was very exciting, and I wouldn't have to walk anymore. I would just get to, well, in theory, just, glide down the river, and it would be the best time of my life. It was a lot more scary than that. And yeah, it was supposed to be an easy putt, but it wasn't. Maybe I even peed myself. I don't really know, because it's hard to tell because there were holes in the boat and water started coming in, and who's to know if... who knows what happened. So there was a lot more rocks that I kept hitting. Like, we're not very experienced pack rafters. So I would try and steer my boat left, and it would decide that it just wanted to go right and just go right over the rocks. And it was fun in a I never want to go back there again way. But I wasn't walking, so that was pretty exciting.
Clemenceau, yeah. I remember climbing Clemenceau with 2 good friends, Brian Webster and Hilary Vaughn, when we were on a ski traverse. We were trying to get from the Clemenceau out to, eventually we were going to try to get all the way out to probably the Wapta, but in the end we had pretty foul weather when we got stuck in behind King Edward for like 4 days, and finally ended up coming all the way out the Athabasca River with 1,000 fords of the river. Yeah, that was quite an epic trip. But in the early part of the trip, we had actually pretty good weather, and we climbed Clemenceau, getting up the summit ridge. And at this point, Brian was ahead, and I think I was second, and Hilary was behind, as I recall. And Brian got just a little bit too close to the cornice, and all of a sudden he fell through, and he didn't go very far. He fell through and kind of plopped. And, I'm looking at him, he's looking at me. And finally he looks up and he says, "For God's sake, Sylvia, just back up, will you?" Because he looked fine. He didn't look like he was, anyways. Yeah, there he was on the wrong side of the cornice.
There was friends of mine who, when they did Clemenceau, it was a summer where it was really open, the glacier going up from, I can't remember the aspect there, but, the main route. And they got to some crevasses they couldn't get across, and they were about to turn around and go back. And this big serac comes tumbling down towards them, and it lodged right into the crevasse, and they're able to just walk right across it.
Good timing.
Yeah, either that or it's going to kill them.
After getting some minor damage to our rafts from running the Kinbasket River, we decided to walk the last few kilometers to the edge of the Kinbasket Reservoir, the large body of water which marked the end of our route. The Kinbasket Reservoir stretches near 200 kilometers from the communities of Velmont in the north to Golden in the south, and was formed by the damming of the Columbia River in the 1960s and 70s, completed with the formation of Mica Dam, which was raised to a height of 240 meters. When built, the reservoir flooded evidence of past logging along the Columbia watershed. Every year, the height of the reservoir varies by as much as 30 meters, revealing a very different character from spring to fall.
The things that I value most in climbing 11,000ers, hands down, is the people that I'm with. Usually I'm with somebody that I'm very close with, a close friend, somebody that I have a great deal of trust in. Like I said before, it's the journey and it's the camaraderie. It's hanging around the campsite, telling stories or making dinner, the hike in, the hike out, the trust that you have when you're on a rope with someone. To me, life in the mountains, once you're in the mountains, I think it does become much simpler. And that's what I love. That's what I value about being in the mountains, is it takes you from this really complex world of life and, all the stuff that we deal with in life. But when you're in the mountains and when you're climbing, life gets simple. All you're really thinking about is, your day, your route, the people you're with, your safety, having fun, all that kind of stuff. But to me, that's what it's all about.
After a week and a half of terror, triumph, and challenge, Liam and I had reached the edge of the Kinbasket Reservoir. The summit of Tsar was only a small part of a much larger journey. We had fallen into a rhythm of camping and climbing, and appreciating small moments of beauty when we came across them. Our trip to Tsar showed us that there are still places in the Rockies where true adventure can be found.
When we were camping right beside the reservoir and got a message from Kat that she was just, 6 kilometers away down the lake on the other side. That was extremely exciting. That we didn't have to hike the extra 60 kilometers. Yay! It's always a happy and sad moment when you finish a trip. Happy in the sense that you accomplished the trip, sad that it's over, and, you know, what do I do now? You set out what you wanted to do, and now that's done, and it's almost expected that you have to do something else. And, you know, it's simple in the bush. Like, you wake up, you have your breakfast, you hit the trail, and you keep going until you get to camp, and then it's dinner time in bed. There's not that much to, you know, it's very simple at the same time, because it's all about survival, eating, and sleep, really. In the bush, it's living each moment, if that makes sense. In retrospect, would I repeat this route? No. I really don't think so. I mean, certainly over time blunts memories for sure. I mean, it was an awesome trip. You know, like, it was quite a classic adventure. And it was very exciting. But would I redo it? No. I don't think so, no. I'm good. I'll go somewhere else.
The only advice I would have for people wanting to do it is, you know, find good, reliable people to go with. If it's a project, it's great to find a reliable partner that you can find who shares the same kind of goals. And because it's so loose, and the weather's so unpredictable, just be prepared for a lot of things. Take your time, be safe, turn around if you have to. Those peaks are still going to be there.
Well, I think with the 11,000ers becoming more popular, it's both it's a good thing and it's a bad thing. I mean, to see that many more people now pulled into the mountains, I just hope that people, continue to get the experience they need before heading into the hills, instead of just, reading quick reviews on social media. But I also think it's great to see just more people turned on to getting out and exploring in the mountains. We have a pretty special range of mountains here.
Incredibly beautiful, incredibly rugged, challenging, but rewarding. Enjoy the journey. That's about it.